certainly it might sound great to stay in the country and fight, but if you don't have health care, how are you going to do that? Or if your kid's not going to be able to go to school, or they're going to get shot up in a school because nobody's willing to enforce the rules to prevent kids from coming to school with guns, or you can think of a whole host of other reasons why people might not want to stick around, and it would be perfectly logical and rational. And we don't know how bad it's going to get is the problem. So the people that are reading history and going, it's going to get really bad, are probably smart to get out faster than the people that are saying stick around and fight. I can't predict the future either. I don't know if it's going to get better. I mean, I'm heartened by the large size of the protests, but that doesn't mean they're going to win. And we could end up in a situation where they start rounding people up who went and protested. And if that happens, I think you're going to see a big uptick in people thinking it's perfectly rational to get out.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Margaret Stock. Margaret is an immigration attorney and retired lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Reserve. She is a recognized expert on immigration law as it applies to the U.S. military and its veterans. In 2013, she was a recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, often referred to as a Genius Grant. She has taught law at the United States Military Academy in West Point. She ran for the United States Senate as an independent candidate in the 2016 Senate election in Alaska, losing to the incumbent Senator Lisa Murkowski. Today, we discuss her life, but also her concerns about the politicization of the U.S. military, the change in the way our country treats its immigrants, and the illegal extra-judicial killings of Venezuelans by the U.S. military in the Caribbean Sea. Margaret Stock, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you were born in Boston in 1961?
That is true.
And grew up in Massachusetts?
I grew up in Massachusetts. I grew up playing Little League Baseball under a pseudonym because girls weren't allowed to play. And so my father called me Mike and let me play on the team.
Because you love baseball that much?
I was really good at it. Yeah.
And your dad, I assume, wanted you to play?
He did. He'd been a minor league player in Pennsylvania in college, and he was really good at baseball. And he saw that I had talent. My brother and I would play with him all the time in the backyard. But girls were not allowed to play Little League then, so he went to the coach and he said, my daughter's really good. And the coach said, yeah, sure, and show me. And then the coach said, you're really good. So they decided to dress me up as a boy and call me Mike.
And so as Mike, how long did you play?
I think it was a couple of years. And I almost got outed once when a couple of boys from my school rode bicycles up to a game that I was playing. I was second base person. And they said, hey, they got a girl playing on their team. And they started pointing at me because I was in their class. And all the kids on the team turned around and looked at me and said, girl, what girl? I don't see a girl. You don't see a girl, do you? There's no girls here.
So they covered for you?
They covered for me. And then everybody on the team knew I was a girl.
Did you have any friends at school that were girls that knew that you were doing this?
My best friend knew about it. And then eventually we created a girls team. And I was in the newspaper in my hometown for having started up a girls baseball team. And the first game that we played was against the boys team and we beat them. And it was in the newspaper. So then everybody in town knew what had happened.
So you were close to your dad?
Yeah, I was very close to my dad. But he passed away when I was a teenager.
He had a heart attack when you were 15?
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, it was tough on my family, and we kind of split up, and I ended up in a homeless shelter for a while, and then I got somebody who was an adult took over guardianship of me. So tough times. I dropped out of high school, and then eventually got into college, thanks to a high school guidance counselor who was looking out for me. She called me up one day, and she said, I know you dropped out of high school, but you really need to go to college. I'm going to call my friend at the BU admissions office at Boston University and see if we can get you in, even though you don't have a high school diploma. And BU admitted me based on my test scores.
And you transferred to Harvard from Boston University?
I did. I completed 2 years at Boston University. I joined ROTC, got commissioned as a second lieutenant. My high school went back and gave me a high school diploma after my first year at Boston University. And I ended up being in an Army Reserve unit. That was also a funny story because it was an infantry unit and women weren't supposed to be in the infantry, but somebody coded my gender wrong in the computer. So I ended up getting assigned as a female in an infantry unit as an officer.
Like a platoon leader?
Yeah. Platoon leader in an infantry unit. The soldiers had never had a female officer before, but they just thought, oh, the Army must be changing the rules or something. You know, women are allowed to serve in infantry units now.
So being a female platoon leader back then, I'm sure was extraordinarily unusual. I will say that I have met an Army infantry female platoon leader. It's still very unusual.
Well, it was definitely unusual. I was the only female officer in the whole brigade.
Wow.
And I was the only female in my unit. There were a couple of women at the headquarters that were like typing, typists or something. But I was definitely the only one running around in the field with a firearm and blowing things up and practice attacks and that kind of thing.
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I would say that like you being the only female on the Little League team was preparation.
It was, and I was having a good time, and my troops, they thought it was kind of funny. They were training me. I never had any trouble with my soldiers at all. I did occasionally get harassed by more senior officers. And then I had some more senior officers who didn't know how to deal with a female officer. They just weren't sure what to do.
Well, I deployed to Kosovo in 2019 with the Alaska Army National Guard, and we were spread out over 3 bases, and the senior enlisted at one of the bases said, we don't want any problems here, so we're going to have all males. And so that in 2019, they were making decisions being like, no females allowed on this base, and that way we won't have any problems. And I'm a PA, and I was running the battalion aid station, and half my medics were female. So I felt like I was constantly having to make a case that actually they're not a problem. They don't cause problems. But it was a constant battle.
It was more like people didn't know what the rules were. What I found over the course of my career in the Army was if you figured out what the rules were that were going to make the thing work fine, and people followed the rules, there weren't any problems. It wasn't the fact that I was female that was the issue. It was just like people thought there's got to be some different way. They just didn't know what the rules were exactly. And they'd been operating a certain way based on only having men around, and they just weren't sure what to do about it. So you had to figure it out.
Why did you join ROTC?
Because they told me they would send me to airborne school and I wouldn't have to pay for it. I was pretty adventurous and I thought it was exciting. It sounded like people in the Army did exciting things, and I liked being outdoors. I liked outdoor sports a lot. I liked hiking and camping, and I had been in the Civil Air Patrol in high school, so I was kind of oriented towards the military as a career, and it just seemed like an exciting thing to do. And I think I was in the Civil Air Patrol, but I had really bad eyesight. So the Air Force wasn't an option because I didn't want to be anything in the Air Force except maybe a pilot. And I couldn't be a pilot because my eyes were bad. But the Army offered me a lot of adventure opportunities. And they told me specifically if I signed up for ROTC, they'd send me to jump school. And they did. They gave me the jump school slot for the cadets the first year that I joined. And I went down to Fort Benning and had a great time. I got in really great shape. When I came back, I could do like 90 push-ups in 2 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, because it was airborne school. Have you been to airborne school?
No.
Okay. Well, all they do all day long is physical fitness, and you're just doing push-ups all day long and running and doing crazy stuff. And you just get in incredibly good shape. At least I did. When I came back, I was like in fantastic shape. They were yelling at you all day long, And the instructors were called black hats, and we were all afraid of them, and they could throw you out of the school at any moment. So you had to do exactly what they told you to do. And they like to tell you to do push-ups all the time. So I was constantly doing push-ups for hours every day, just drop and give me 20 or whatever. And
well, 90 push-ups in 2 minutes is definitely above standard for the men. So when there's these debates about the watering down of standards in order to accommodate women, I would assume that you would take offense to that argument.
Well, when I heard Pete Hegseth talking about the highest male standard, I was kind of laughing because it's very individual. And we live in Alaska where there are a ton of really rock solid women athletes out there in the mountains. You can remember Nancy Pease, lots of other folks. There are women who can run circles around any guy in the mountains. And there's other women that are not into physical fitness. And there's men that are really good at working out in the gym and they look really good, but they can't carry a pack very long and they struggle in the mountains. I remember being on an exercise once with a really big guy who was a football player, and we were going up and down in the mountains and he just couldn't carry his pack anymore. He was too exhausted. And I ended up carrying the guy's pack with my pack too. And here I am, a short female, but I was really rugged and tough at the time, and he just wasn't used to doing that kind of thing. So he just wasn't good at it. I think it's very individual specific, and I don't think you should have the assumption that men are always going to be better than women at certain things. It depends on the individual.
And you graduated from Radcliffe in 85?
85, Harvard Radcliffe, yeah. Back then, you got 2 diplomas, a double diploma, basically. If you're a woman, you got a Harvard college degree and a Radcliffe degree at the same time.
That's so weird because that feels so recent. And for them still to go through like a women's college and...
Right. Well, in the old days, the women all got Radcliffe degrees and the men all got Harvard degrees. And then at some point, I don't remember what year, they started giving women a degree that had both the signature of the president of Harvard and the president of Radcliffe on it. And that's what I got. And then later on, they just got rid of the Radcliffe degree altogether. And it's now the Radcliffe Institute.
You graduated from Harvard Law School in 1982.
That's right.
So was there a break? And did you do stuff between finishing college and going to?
I did. So I graduated from college and I was still in the Army Reserve. And the Army Reserve called me up and they said, we see that you're an Army Reserve officer and we're having the Reagan buildup and we need officers. And if you volunteer for 3 years of active duty, we will give you your choice of assignment. And I said, great, what are my choices? And they said, Korea, Panama, or Alaska. Take your pick. I picked Alaska. So they said, great, we'll cut you orders for 3 years of active duty, and you have to go to a school down in Fort McClellan, Alabama first before you go on your active duty tour because you haven't finished this officer school that you're supposed to go to. So I was basically hanging out waiting for orders to Alaska to join the 6th Infantry Division, Arctic Light.
So you stayed an infantry officer?
Well, I wasn't an infantry officer. I'd never been an actual infantry branch. I was branch military police because women were allowed to do that. They called it chicks infantry back then. So they would put the women in the military police, but they would assign them a lot of times to infantry units. So that's what I'd actually branch military police when I was assigned to the infantry unit.
What was that experience like in Alaska when you first got here?
I had a great time. I mean, I got up here and I was like heaven on earth. You know, I'm in this Army unit that on Fridays, they either go ruck marching or they go up Arctic Valley and go skiing. And I was getting paid, you know, to strap on some skis and a white uniform and go skiing and go ruck marching. And I just loved it. I had a blast. I did Crow Pass hike and Indian Valley hike. And I was taking my platoon up and down Wolverine for fun, you know, on training days. And I just thought it was really great. And I was a military police officer, so I was enjoying the law enforcement aspect of it. You know, I rode patrol and I did like regular things that a police officer would do. That was pretty exciting.
I imagine it was different back then. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the base open prior to 9/11? I mean, could people just drive on to J-Bear?
Well, it wasn't J-Bear. It was Fort Richardson and Elmendorf, and they were actually separated. There was a gate between them. And you could drive onto the base, but you had to clear the gate. And I was actually in charge of the gate guards as a military police officer. So
it's similar to what it is today?
Similar to what it is today, except there was no joint base. It was easier to get onto the base back then, but you know, they tightened up security and they want more identification documents and things like that. And you could get between Elmendorf and Fort Richardson without going through a gate if you didn't go through the main road. But they were totally separate bases. And I was in charge of Fort Richardson's base security, and I had nothing to do with the Air Force side of it at all. The only time we went over there was for exercises.
Got it. And what attracted you to law? Why did you want to go to law school?
Well, when I was a teenager, I had been in the juvenile court system because somebody was trying to get guardianship of me. I wasn't an offender or anything, but there was like a guardianship fight over me, basically, when I was a teenager because I was homeless. And that was my first exposure to law. And I thought it was pretty interesting.
Were your parents divorced or?
No, my father died. And then my mother was struggling to take care of all of us kids.
So there were 9 kids?
She had 9 kids, although at that point there were 8 left. And it was just really difficult for her. And some of us ended up in foster care and so forth. And then there was a guardianship fight over me when I was a teenager. And I had to keep going to court. You know, and somebody eventually got guardianship of me. And then I stopped having to go to court all the time. But the judge would ask me, like, do you want to be with this person or not? You know, kind of thing.
What would you say?
Well, I wanted to be with the person who was trying to get guardianship. So I would say yes. And, you know, I was old enough that I had a say in it.
So that experience was what attracted you to the law?
It got me going. I was going to court, you know, and saying there's a judge and, you know, they get to decide whether I get to be in foster care or whether I get to go with this other person that I like, you know, that I want to be in charge of me.
Well, what was the argument against it?
You have to qualify to be a guardian of a teenager. You know, they got to make sure you're not like a child predator or something, you know. So they were sort of going through this child in need of aid program. But I was a homeless child, and they were trying to figure out what my placement should be.
Was your mom just not coping well?
She wasn't coping with anything at that time. Yeah, I mean, she's fine now, but you have to imagine what it's like, when your husband passes away after illness, and you've got all these kids, and she was just not handling it at all. It's overwhelming. Yeah.
But you have a relationship with your mother today.
I do.
The other kids.
She's in her 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
We're getting along fine now. Yeah.
So you went to Harvard Law School. That's the best.
It's the only place I got in. Really?
So tell us about that.
The only place I applied.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd gone to Harvard undergraduate, and I really liked it. And I thought Harvard Law School would be as fun as Harvard undergraduate was, so why not? I was actually on active duty up here at Fort Richardson when I found out I was admitted to Harvard Law School, and I still had 6 months of obligation to be on active duty, so I had to go to my chain of command and get released early from active duty to go back to Harvard Law School, and they were all fine with it. They we're not going to tell you. You got to stay. You can't go to Harvard Law School. Yeah.
Right. Was Harvard Law School as fun as Harvard undergrad had been?
No, it was pretty boring, and I skipped class a lot, but, they gave me a degree anyway. And the other problem that happened was I fell in love with an Alaska guy a couple months before I was heading off to Harvard Law School. So during my time at Harvard Law School, I was constantly traveling back and forth between Alaska and Harvard Law School, trying to maintain my romantic relationship with this particular person whom I ended up marrying a couple days after I graduated from law school. And we're still married, and I'm still here.
Wow, that's really impressive. Most people going to Harvard Law School who found it boring and were skipping a lot of class and were spending an inordinate amount of time traveling back and forth to Alaska, which is not driving to New York City. It was traveling across the continent. So I mean, a lot of lost sleep, a lot of lost time. And you still graduated from Harvard Law School. I
did. I graduated with honors. Yep. I was editor-in-chief of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. I was the first woman ever to be editor-in-chief of that particular journal. I was also 1 year behind somebody named Barack Obama, and I didn't know him, but I knew who he was, and I knew that he chain smoked because I would have to walk through his cigarette smoke on the way in to get my mail every day at the Harkness Commons. So I remember Barack Obama smoking really clearly.
You've breathed his smoke a few times.
I breathed his smoke a few times, yeah. But I didn't ever talk to him or anything. He was a year ahead of me.
So you came back to Alaska, you got married. Then what did you do?
Well, my husband's law firm offered me a job without an interview. So I accepted the job, and I worked there for about 5 years. And then at the same time, the Army Reserve had interestingly assigned me to Japan out of the blue in the middle of the Gulf War. So they called me up in the middle of the Gulf War and sent me to Japan. And I got over to Japan, and I'd never been there, and did not know anything about Japan.
Quick question. Being in the reserve then, did you move over and become a JAG?
No, I never became a JAG. I did go to the JAG school, and I graduated from the JAG basic school, but I never transferred to the JAG Corps, which is a bunch of paperwork that you had to do.
So you stayed as an MP?
So I stayed as a military police, and I liked being an MP. It was much more physical than being a JAG officer. The JAG officers tended to be hanging out in offices and doing paperwork and everything, and military police was a lot more fun, I thought.
And so you weren't using your degree?
Well, it wasn't that I wasn't using my degree, because I was still using a lot of the things that I had learned. I was doing security and anti-terrorism, and I was a deputy provost marshal at one point in Japan for U.S. Forces Japan. So I stayed assigned to Japan for quite a while. And I did really exciting things. And I fell in love with Japan, and I learned to speak Japanese and read and write Japanese.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, how did your husband feel about you getting sent to Japan?
Well, he didn't like it when I was away, but he came over at least one time. In fact, we managed to do military duty and our honeymoon in Japan at the same time. I had Army duty in Japan, so he came over and joined me in Japan, and we went all over the place on Japan Rail Pass and had a good time. And I climbed Mount Fuji that year, so I was doing a lot of exciting stuff.
What type of law was your husband's law firm?
He was with an old Alaska law firm called Atkinson, Conway, and Gagnon, and they did mainly civil litigation. So things like plane crashes and car crashes and contract disputes and insurance defense work, that kind of thing.
And so is that what you did when you went to work there?
I did it at first, and I thought it was boring. I took up an immigration pro bono case from Alaska Legal Services Corporation, and I fell in love with immigration law. So gradually, over the time period when I was working at his firm, I started developing my own practice of immigration law because I just thought it was more fun. And then after 5 years, I switched completely. I left his firm and I started my own firm that was going to do immigration law.
What was it about that first case that caught your interest?
It was a case that came to me because Alaska Legal Services was looking for volunteer pro bono lawyers, and I had just passed the bar, and they would call people up and say, "You just passed the bar, you should donate your time and do pro bono." And so I said, "Okay, fine. What are my options?" And they said, "Well, we see that you took immigration law in law school," because you had to give them a list of like classes that you took in law school. And they said, "We have one case. The guy's guilty. It'll only be like 10 to 20 hours." So I took the case, and then I got into it, and I realized the guy wasn't guilty at all. And the system was just really messed up.
What was the charge?
They were claiming he had smuggled his girlfriend in over the Canadian border, and they had seized his vehicle and dumped him in Glen Allen without a car, and he had to make his way back to Anchorage, and they were trying to deport him. And it turned out that like he hadn't been smuggling anybody at all. That was just like a false charge. And so I spent like 400 hours on the case, and I won it. I got the charges dropped, and the guy was fine. And it was a fascinating case to me because prior to that, I didn't know anything about the immigration system. And once I started handling the case, I realized that the system was really screwed up. The law was really messed up. It didn't make any sense. It was kind of like a secret agency that nobody knew what the rules were, and they were always playing games with people. And they're doing things like seizing the guy's car in the middle of Glen Allen and dumping him by the side of the road. And he's supposed to make his way back to Anchorage somehow, And I just thought this was crazy. And then I also found that there weren't too many lawyers doing it. So you could make a huge impact being an attorney if you were willing to learn this area of the law. And people's lives are at stake. So it wasn't boring like arguing about insurance clauses in a contract or something. It was life and death for the individual that you were representing. And I just found that to be exciting.
And that was 92, 93, like early on?
This would have been, 93, 94, 95. That time period. Yeah, because I was admitted to the bar in 93.
When I hear that story about somebody having their car taken away and a false charge of smuggling a person in and being left to figure out how to get from Glen Allen to Anchorage, I'm assuming with not a lot of money in his pocket.
He hitchhiked. Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't sound like things are better in 2025.
They're worse in 2025. Yeah.
How does it feel to have spent like 30 years working in a system that's gotten worse instead of better?
I find it a little disheartening because I think when I was younger, I thought America was progressing and we were getting better at doing things. And I always thought the law was progressing, and it doesn't seem that way to me anymore. It seems like we're going backwards, and it's hurting our country. It's not good for the country.
Well, getting back to your story, so you were in Japan, you came back to Alaska.
So I had two lives. I had one life as a private lawyer in private practice in Anchorage and another life as an Army reservist. And my Army Reserve life required me to fly every so often off to Japan and do work or whatever. And then I wasn't totally in Japan my whole Army Reserve career. Eventually, I got assigned to a Hawaii unit, the 4960th Multifunctional Training Brigade. I was a trainer, so I was supposed to teach officers different classes. And I did that for many years, but I was part of the unit in Hawaii. They had a branch in Alaska at Fort Richardson. So I had this parallel life, I was a private lawyer, and then I was a Army reservist at the same time. And I was still in the military police. So I was doing military police training and then a lot of advanced officer leadership training, and then learning to be an instructor for other officers. So I did a lot of that. So I taught a lot of the National Guard officers in Alaska.
As somebody who did 9 years in the National Guard, my work in the civilian world was more meaningful. I spent a lot of time in the Guard where, we have formation at 7 a.m, and then not a lot happened before formation at 5 p.m. when we were dismissed. Like that it wasn't always the best use of my time. And so I'm just curious, if you're working on like these life or death cases in your civilian world, and then I don't know, training National Guard officers, I would imagine sometimes it could have been tedious and definitely not as high stakes.
It wasn't as high stakes, but I didn't find it tedious at all. And I think it was because the kind of assignments I had, they gave me a lot of autonomy. For example, the teaching I was doing in the National Guard, I was teaching two classes. One was called Combined Armed Services Staff School, and the other one was called Command and General Staff College. And I was in charge of teaching it, so I could decide not to make it boring for people. And I liked teaching. I thought it was a lot of fun. And we did exciting things, like we'd do a map exercise where we'd pretend to invade a country and now we're evacuating the country. And so we'd try to figure out, are we going to give up Bagram Air Base? Or are we going to invite the Red Cross to help us? So we do all this interagency planning and everything. And it was as realistic as we could make it in terms of like a map exercise. And I actually found it to be a lot of fun. And I'm still in touch with a lot of my students. Some of them ended up being higher ranking guard officers eventually. And I'm still friends with them. But for the most part, I had a pretty good time in the Army Reserve. One of my most memorable stories of serving at Fort Richardson, it's not a good memory, was I was a platoon leader of a military police platoon at one point. And an investigation started because the commander up above me had been harassing women, and he was basically calling women into his office and forcing them to engage in sexual acts and threatening them with being kicked out of the military if they didn't agree to these sexual acts. And this suddenly came to light in the context of a soldier who was being investigated for being a lesbian, who was one of my best soldiers. She was absolutely a superstar, and she had never done anything wrong other than being a lesbian. And the military decided to kick her out because she was a lesbian. It was the don't ask, don't tell era. So I lost one of my best soldiers.
Well, had she told? Or
so she was reporting behavior that she had observed by this white male captain who was sexually harassing other women, and he had apparently tried to sexually harass her as well.
And so he said, oh, well, she's a lesbian.
It came out in the course of the investigation. They were asking people different questions about different people and what they were doing and so forth. And it came out that she had a roommate and who was another woman, and they were engaging in same-sex relationship. And so she got outed, and they ended up kicking her out of the Army. She got an honorable discharge, but she got kicked out, and she was like my best troop.
What happened to that commander?
They allowed him to resign. They didn't criminally prosecute him, even though they should have. I think the command thought the court-martial was going to be too embarrassing because he had been sexually harassing so many people, so many women for so long and getting away with it. And he was pulling rank on them. He was married and he was a captain, and he was pulling rank on these lower enlisted women and forcing them to engage in sexual acts, or he'd threaten them with an Article 15 and ruining their careers. It was criminal, but they let him resign rather than face a court-martial. And I remember being kind of distressed about that because it wasn't fair. They should have court-martialed the guy. It was what it was in that time and place. I think it wasn't popular to go after somebody like that. So they kicked her out. I wished they had kept her and kicked him out rather than...
Do you know what happened to her?
I don't. I never followed up, and I never heard what happened to her in the future. But
how did you end up teaching at West Point?
So I was practicing law, and I was thinking about taking a sabbatical, and West Point offered me basically a short-term instructor position for a couple of years was the theory. And I was going to take a sabbatical, and this was the summer of 2001, and I had really poor timing. So they hired me to teach constitutional and military law and national security law in June of 2001, and I was teaching at West Point when the planes hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. I was actually in class that day when it happened. And that day, my life basically changed forever because it turned out that I was the only person in the country that had a background in both immigration law and national security law that anybody could find. So I ended up being the point person for the government on immigration and national security issues. And I started doing that and did that for about 9 years.
And you stayed at West Point? Or did you go to DC or like kind of?
Well, it was complicated. So I was assigned to West Point from 2001 until 2010 when I hit my retirement date, but they would detail me all over the place. So I did different details, and most of them in the later years were at the Pentagon. Where I was officially assigned to West Point, but I was staying in a hotel in Crystal City or Pentagon City, and then I would just go to the Pentagon every day to work. And I was also doing it part-time, so I was flying back and forth to Alaska all the time. And I was working out of my basement in Anchorage. So they basically had me doing remote work a lot.
Before remote work was really a thing.
Yeah, before remote work was really a thing. I'd get up at like 4 a.m. because it's 8 o'clock on the East Coast, and I'd start doing stuff on my laptop and conference calls and emails and everything. And then when they needed me, I would fly to DC And they assigned a travel agent that their only job was to get me to meetings in DC all the time.
Is there a particular problem that you could share that would give us an example of the types of decisions or work that you were doing?
Well, the big one was we got attacked on 9/11, and we found out shortly thereafter that we had intercepts from the hijackers where they said what their plans were, but they were in a foreign language, and nobody had listened to the intercepts and nobody had translated the foreign language. And we could have prevented the attacks if we had translated these intercepts and acted on them. But the U.S. government didn't have enough people who spoke those
Arabic,
languages. There weren't enough people in the State Department. There weren't enough people in the intelligence agencies, and there's not enough people in the military. And it was a glaring lack of capacity that I was kind of in the middle of all this, because people were asking me, how do we get people that speak these languages? And I said, well, the easy way is you recruit immigrants because they're in the country already. They passed all the vetting to get in the country. Why don't you let these people join the military, and then you don't have to worry about sending Americans to Monterey, California, and trying to get them up to a low level of conversational ability in Arabic in a year, which is costing the government a ton of money. And they couldn't get people up to native language level. So this became the genesis of the recruiting program known as Military Accessions Vital to the National Interest. And everybody calls me the mother of MAVNI because I was basically the person tasked with conceiving and then executing on the program at the Pentagon. And John McCain actually got the whole thing started. He was going to be doing a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing in Miami in July of 2006. And you can go online and find the transcript of this hearing. It's worth reading, actually. So he actually called me up and asked me if I'd fly from Anchorage down to Miami to testify at the hearing because he wanted me to talk about how to get more immigrants into the military. And I said I would do that. And I flew from Anchorage in the early July down to Miami, Florida for the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, which featured Ted Kennedy, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, kind of the whole rack of very senior senators who are on the Armed Services Committee. And they actually asked me in the course of the hearing how to recruit more immigrants for the military. But the hearing was shanghaied by Peter Pace, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They had invited him to testify, and Ted Kennedy asked him a question about his mother, which triggered General Pace to start tearing up. And of course, that immediately caused all the news reporters to come forward with their cameras to get a picture of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff crying in the middle of a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Ted Kennedy looked completely shocked, but it turned out that General Pace's mother was an immigrant. And when he was a child, he had apparently witnessed her being accosted by immigration agents. And so it triggered emotional memories for him. And you can kind of see that if you go look at the hearing transcript. But the next day, all the headlines are all about chairman sheds tear at immigration hearing, So anyway, that was John McCain had asked me at the hearing, how do we recruit more immigrants for the military? And I gave him the legal authority. And right after that, a lot of people at the Pentagon were contacting me and trying to figure out how to get this off the ground. And that culminated in January 2008. I got given military orders from the Secretary of the Army to start working on a program to try to implement. And I went to a friend of mine who had been at the Pentagon. He was a very senior officer at the Pentagon. And I said to him, how long do you think it's going to take me to get this project through the Pentagon? And he said, Margaret, it's a brilliant idea. The Pentagon crushes great ideas. I think you're not going to get this through the Pentagon. They're going to crush it. But if you do get it through, it's going to take you about 5 years. So that was in January of 2008, and I got the Secretary of Defense to sign off on it in November of 2008. So it took less than a year.
Well, I was in the Guard from 2014 to 2023, and I definitely met folks who were immigrants, who were not citizens yet, who were serving. I mean, from Africa, from Asia, from all over. Ukraine. I mean, I had a friend who was from Ukraine. It's been fascinating for me to watch the immigration debate because of that experience of being like, hey, you guys know that these people are serving in our military.
Yep, and they're essential to our military. In fact, I got a medal from Special Operations Command for diversifying their force. They were having trouble. They'd send people into a country, but the people they're sending in cannot blend in. Mm-hmm. The minute they land on the ground, they look exactly like an American, and they don't speak the language, and they don't know what's going on. And Special Operations Command found it incredibly helpful to have local people who were Americans on the ground with their teams. I remember one general telling me that they had a mission in Africa that was super successful because they put one of my recruits on the team when they went into this village, and he was actually from the village. And he walks into the village in an American military uniform with Special Forces team. Everybody in the village knew the guy, and he knew all the dirt on them. He knew who had stolen whose fish, 20 years before. And he spoke the local language fluently, and the mission was like 100% successful because this guy was with the unit when they went back. And the general told me that. He said they wouldn't have had any luck with the mission except for the fact that this guy was with them.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it feels like the current leadership, Secretary Hegseth, isn't thinking about mission success in the same way.
I don't think that's going out on a limb. He said that he doesn't value any kind of diversity. He has said publicly that he thinks the motto, diversity is our strength, is like the stupidest thing he's ever heard anyone say. Personally, I think the stupidest thing I've ever heard anyone say is Hegseth saying that diversity is our strength is the stupidest thing, because it is our strength. It's been our strength since 1775. The fact that he doesn't know military history at all is alarming to me. And all you got to do is look around and look at Alaska and the Alaska Natives' contribution to military history. You can look at the Japanese Americans' contribution to military history, German Americans, immigrants from Germany helping us win World War II. Jewish refugees helped us win World War II. Japanese Americans helped us win World War II. The Navajo code talkers. Diversity is our strength and always has been. And the fact that the SecDef doesn't understand that is rather alarming. It should be alarming to people.
Bouncing back to your bio, in your Wikipedia, it says that you were the member of the Federalist Society.
I was, yeah. I left the Federalist Society in 2016, I believe. Yeah.
Well, yeah, 2016 is when Trump was elected in.
Right.
They were, just for listeners who was like, Federalist Society, that sounds familiar. American conservative libertarian legal organization, advocates for an originalist interpretation of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And according to Politico in 2019, one of the most influential legal organizations in history because of the way it's shaped our judiciary. And I think I would say Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh.
Neil Gorsuch was in my class at Harvard. Forgot to mention that. I'm in a picture with him.
Were you friends with him?
No, he wasn't actually into conservative circles at that point.
But you were in conservative circles at that point.
Yeah. I was. The Federalist Society Law Review was the Harvard Journal of Public Policy. And that's the one that I was editor-in-chief of, first woman to be editor-in-chief of that journal.
Tell us about your involvement in conservative legal circles and then what led you to leave in 2016.
Sure. So I had been a Republican and I believed in the Constitution, and I still believe in the Constitution. But I would say I was more of the traditional part of the Republican Party, the folks that believed that you should interpret the Constitution using the words of the Constitution, not making up your own meaning of it. And I became distressed when people started misinterpreting the Constitution, I guess. Clearly, people that knew better. A good example is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It's crystal clear to me. I've done a ton of research and writing on the 14th Amendment. And the Republican Party used to be a big proponent of the 14th Amendment. It was their star amendment.
For folks who are like, what's the 14th Amendment? What is the 14th Amendment?
Well, the 14th Amendment has a lot of stuff in it, but one of the big things it has in it is the statement that people born in America and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are American citizens at birth. And the language is clear and the history is clear. And for some reason, some people in the Republican Party have popularized the notion that the language is not clear and they can just rewrite it. It's just false. And it's distressing to me that people claim that, it's been misinterpreted for more than 100 years. People will say that. And some prominent members of the Federalist Society were saying that, including John Eastman, whom I used to debate regularly on the topic. And he would literally get up in meetings where we were debating and he would lie about the 14th Amendment and tell people things that weren't true, that he knew weren't true. He would say things like, there's no such thing as dual citizenship in America. And I'd go, John, pull out your U.S. passport. You'll notice the notation there about dual citizenship. And yes, we have dual citizenship. And there's a Supreme Court decision that says we have dual citizenship. And he would just literally tell lies at the debates. And that started to become a trend, where people would, instead of debating on the facts and the law, they would just get up and lie to the audience. And the theory being, I guess, if you say something enough, people start to believe it. So that was really distressing me, that an organization that purported to follow the law was starting to people were just lying all the time.
And so that's what pushed you over the edge and you left in 2016?
Yeah, and Trump pushed me over the edge. I mean, I just couldn't, the party had left me because it had now become this Trump cult.
Well, what was interesting when I was researching for your interview and reading about the Federalist Society and sort of the history of the Federalist Society, there was some fear by some members of the Federalist Society before Trump's election that he was actually a liberal in sheep's clothing and that he was going to maybe appoint a bunch of liberals. And the way I interpreted the article I was reading was that Trump overcompensated and was like, no, I'll just appoint whoever you guys want. Do you guys just tell me who to, like, you guys give me the list and that's the only list that I look at. So I don't know, it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, I think he doesn't like the Federalist Society anymore. He decided that they misled him somehow. That's my impression, but
because any judge that he's appointed that makes a decision that he doesn't like, well, then it's the fault of whoever gave him that list.
Yeah, he doesn't like Amy Coney Barrett anymore, apparently, and he's upset at Neil Gorsuch, and yeah. But I left the party before he got elected. I decided that I just didn't like the Trump trend, and it wasn't consistent with my principles, nor was it consistent with the Constitution.
Well, since we're talking about 2016, you ran for the Senate.
I did. I ran for the United States Senate in Alaska in 2016.
What led you to run for higher office, and what was that experience like?
Well, it was pretty exciting. I had a really good time. I'd say if you got your bucket list out there, running for political office is definitely something that should be on everybody's bucket list. I learned a ton of stuff about policy issues that I hadn't explored before, and I got to meet all kinds of Alaskans I hadn't met before. I got to travel all over the state in a way that I hadn't done before. The debates were really interesting. I mean, I just had a really good time. What led me to run was people were asking me to run because they were disenchanted with the slate of candidates who were running. And that year it was like Joe Miller and Lisa Murkowski. People were very distressed with Lisa Murkowski and didn't think she was sticking to her principles.
And Ray Metcalf.
And he was a fake Democrat. You know, he'd been a Republican and he literally decided to become a Democrat because there was nobody else that was a Democrat, and he would be able to get the people that, you know, just vote with a D, get their vote. So I had a pretty interesting time. You know, I obviously didn't win, but I felt like it was worth doing.
I have only run for state house, so my district is geographically small, you know, just a few neighborhoods in Anchorage. I can't imagine what it would be like to be running across the whole state, especially a state as big as ours.
It was hard, and it was a lot of flying and driving, but I had a really good campaign team. They were really enthusiastic. There were a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters that gravitated to my campaign. And then the Democratic Party didn't like Ray Metcalf, even though he was the guy that won their primary. So the Democratic Party was actually backing me. I don't know if you caught.
So you didn't run in the Democratic primary?
No, I couldn't because I was an independent.
And they hadn't changed their policies
and they hadn't changed. They filed a lawsuit, and I was actually part of the lawsuit in the sense that they needed somebody who was harmed by the existing policy. And so they had a lawsuit going to allow independents to run in their primary. And unfortunately, the courts didn't rule on the lawsuit before the primary, so I was not allowed to run in the primary.
And why do you think Ray Metcalf won that primary?
It was purely because people didn't know the names of any of the other Ds that were running. And I think if he had not run, if it had been an open primary and I'd been able to run, he wouldn't have won at all. I would have won the primary. And I could have been the United States Senator, but that's how things work out. So,
any particularly memorable story from that period of your life?
I think one of the more interesting ones was I had been homeless as a teenager, and we went up to Fairbanks, and we were camped out like homeless people as part of the campaign. You know, we were working with the local folks on social issues and so forth, and I got to camp out like a homeless person for one night with my campaign team. And, you know, it kind of gave me flashbacks to being a teenager. But, I mean, overall, going to the fairs and shaking hands with people and talking to people, it was all pretty exciting.
And then 2013, you got the MacArthur Genius Grant. So going back a few years.
That's going back. That was before that.
Yeah, that was before that. What did that mean to you, and what did you use it for?
It came out of the blue, big surprise. They don't tell you ahead of time that you've been nominated. They just surprise you with it. And I was very, very surprised to get it because I thought most of the stuff that I was doing, nobody knew I was doing it. So I was pretty shocked to find out that the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation had the inside intel on all this stuff that I've been doing. So that was kind of surprising. but it made a huge difference in my life. I mean, up till that point, I had been trying to help a lot of people and I didn't have the money to help them. So the money made a big difference because it allowed me to do a lot of pro bono work that I hadn't been able to afford to do before. So I could help a lot more people. And it also gave me recognition that allowed me to do more valuable work because I had the recognition. So I could get into a meeting that I couldn't have gotten into before, and then I could make changes because of that. So the recognition was really helpful in terms of getting work done.
Well, and prior to that, doing the immigration work that you were doing, how much pro bono work were you able to do, and how were you finding clients that could pay, and how did that happen?
So I had been getting paid by the military to do work from 2001 until 2010. Then I retired in 2010, and I was basically doing work on my own dime, trying to advance people. And I was working sometimes in private practice. So I worked for a law firm here in town, but they wanted me to bill hours for corporate clients. So it was really difficult. I mean, I just wasn't making a lot of money. And luckily, I had a tolerant spouse who was basically supporting our family because I wasn't making any money. And I had some pretty memorable scenes where my spouse would go, "Why can't you get these people to pay you for this?" And I tried to explain to him that the Pentagon wasn't going to pay me because I had retired and these other people didn't have any money. And he was like, "You got to figure out a way to get people to pay you for this." So he had been, I wouldn't say griping, but, telling me that I'm not monetizing the work that I'm doing, which is so valuable. And then when the MacArthur people named me a MacArthur Genius, he came downstairs and he looked at me and he said, "You really deserve that award."
It's kind of like back pay.
Kind of like back pay, yeah. But it was funny because, my spouse thinks I deserve this award. That's really great. It was pretty funny. He was sincerely like, "I can't believe they gave you this award, but you deserve it." So it basically pays your salary for 5 years. So it allowed me to do a lot of work without getting paid. I didn't have to make clients pay me.
When you lost that race against Lisa Murkowski in 2016, I imagine that you did very well in debates.
Yes, I would do very well in debates. And also, Lisa and I can talk now because I ran against her. So I can get her ear on things, because we respect each other because I ran against her. So it allowed me to help Alaskans. I don't know if you remember the case that was in the news with Rebecca Trimble, but this was a military spouse who was getting deported. And it was all over the news. It was in the New York Times and other outlets. But basically, she was facing deportation. And Don Young took up the cause and agreed to help me with a private bill, which he introduced in the House. And it got through the House. And then it had to get through the Senate. And Lisa Murkowski's office was extraordinarily helpful in helping me get it through the Senate. I worked really closely with them to make sure the right language was in the bill. And it was the first private bill that had passed through Congress in more than 10 years. Joe Biden signed it into law. I was able to get a green card for this worthy, notable wife of an American citizen, and she was facing deportation. There wasn't any other way to stop it other than getting the private bill through. So I think Murkowski's office was helpful in that regard because I knew them really well, probably as a result of having run against Lisa.
And the work that you've been doing over the past 8 years, immigration work, but primarily military immigration work or just immigration work?
I do all kinds of immigration work. So I do a lot of Alaska-focused stuff. So I represent businesses in Alaska and I represent governments, entities in Alaska and families and people seeking asylum, Native people that don't want to be drafted into the Russian army, and I've represented them.
Explain that.
We have indigenous people that live on the other side of the Bering Strait, and they're Russians, and they don't want to get drafted and sent to fight in Ukraine, and somehow they end up in Alaska, and I can help them by...
Got it. I wasn't clear how you were able to help them while they were in Russia.
I can't. They got to get here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. But I do a lot of asylum work, and then I do a lot of work for people that are outside Alaska. I have a lot of work that I do for different government agencies, a lot of military people. I try to limit the work that I do outside Alaska to things that I'm interested in, not just ordinary cases, but military cases, intelligence community cases.
What makes a case interesting?
If it's something to do with national security, I'm usually more likely to get involved in it, or State Department work.
What's the most concerning thing for you, if you had to pick one, that's happening in your sphere in 2025?
The most concerning thing at the big level is that we don't have the rule of law anymore. We used to pride ourselves as a country on following the laws, and now the executive branch has decided just to break the law and see if they get away with it. And they're just across the board playing this strategy of flood the zone, where they just break the law and see if a lawyer is going to fight them on it. And I find that to be pretty distressing coming from the executive branch. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm not a member of the Federalist Society anymore, is because a lot of people in the Federalist Society have proposed this idea that we just ignore the Constitution and just break the law and see if we get away with it. And I just find that intensely distressing that that's going on. But that's what we're in. We're in a situation right now where, law breaking by the executive branch seems to be the norm, unfortunately.
Well, with immigration, I think the first big scandal was deporting people with no due process and taking them to prisons in countries that they had no relationship to and leaving them there.
Yep, deporting U.S. citizens. They're rounding up people who are American citizens and saying, I just don't believe you, and, we're going to deport you anyway. We don't believe you're an American, or you shouldn't be an American. And I'd had some cases like that before the current administration, but they were pretty rare. And usually once the government realized they had made a mistake, they would fess up and they would play by the rules or play by the book. But they've stopped doing that, and I find that incredibly distressing that the executive branch, which is supposed to enforce the laws, no longer wants to follow the law in many cases.
Did you watch the speeches at Quantico on September 30th?
I watched clips of them, but I did read Pete Hegseth's speech in full because he ordered everybody in the Department of Defense to go read it. And I'm not in the DOD anymore. I'm just retired, but I figured I might as well go read it and see what the fuss is all about. And I found it intensely distressing to read.
He ordered everyone in the Department of Defense to read his speech?
Or watch it. Yeah, you either have to watch a video or you have to read it. And that's the ironic part. In the speech, he decries mandatory training because he doesn't like all this across-the-board mandatory training like race relations training and prevention of sexual harassment. He doesn't like any of that stuff. But he ordered everybody to read his speech or watch his speech, which it's hypocrisy. He says, I don't like this mandatory training stuff, but here's another mandatory training requirement that you have to document that you did.
Right. Something else that kind of leaps out to me from having watched his speech, when he says that he had to get rid of some high-ranking generals, colonels, and he's like, and I get it. It's through no fault of their own. They were just following orders from the previous administration. And to me, that's where my brain kind of explodes. It's like you're acknowledging that they were just following orders. And now you're giving orders that the next president might decide that people who followed that order, the next Secretary of Defense might decide the person who followed those orders needs to be fired if you followed those orders. If you actually went and watched the speech, well, then I don't think you're the type of person that I want serving in my military. It just seems like it creates this vicious cycle.
The whole speech was sophomoric, and it was almost like he has no self-awareness, and he's a very immature person, and he doesn't know anything about military history. He's got a couple of quotes that he grabbed out of context that he threw into his speech because he knows he's supposed to have quotes from military leaders. And, he insulted Mark Milley, who is a really great leader. A lot of people admire Mark Milley, and that was thrown in there. The business about he's going to enforce standards. Everybody knows Pete Hegseth couldn't qualify for a security clearance if they were applying the normal standards for security clearance. But he's gotten some exemption from meeting the standards. And he's claiming in his speech that he's going to enforce all these standards when he himself has been the beneficiary of a loosey-goosey drop the standard in order to hire this guy, as a Fox News commentator to be the Secretary of Defense. He was no CEO.
In order to get a security clearance, and then almost right out of the gate, sharing classified information on a Signal chat with a reporter on the Signal chat with family members.
Exactly. And they just indicted John Bolton for sharing on AOL allegedly classified information with his wife and his daughter. But Pete Hegseth did far worse than that. And so there's just rank hypocrisy in the whole speech. And I know he was upset because apparently the generals and admirals weren't clapping, but I bet they were all trying not to laugh. This is the senior CEO crowd at the Pentagon, and there's this guy that's acting like he just graduated from high school, and he doesn't like the fact that you had to pass an exam to graduate from high school. So he's eliminating the exam because he can do push-ups. So that should be the high school graduation standard. It was bizarre speech. And if I were him, I would be trying to hide that speech and delete it from everything because it's so embarrassing to Pete Hegseth for anybody normal to watch that speech in there. They're not going to be impressed by the guy. He also talked about the fact that he wants the military to be a place where sons and daughters of American parents will want to serve. Any American parent that watches that speech is going to be horrified, and they're not going to want their kid to serve under a guy like him. He's clearly a toxic leader, the epitome of a toxic leader, and he's not aware of any of this. If I were him, I would go out immediately and do a 360-degree evaluation form and see what people say and make it anonymous, because then maybe you'll come to wake up and realize how bad you are. I mean, this is a guy that doesn't meet the standards of the Department of Defense to be a major in the military, and he's now the Secretary of War, as he calls it. It's comical if it weren't tragic.
Well, speaking of flooding the zone, President Trump spoke that day as well. That was when he spoke about the enemy within and using our cities as training areas for our military. And, I think it would seem just beyond belief if you weren't deploying the National Guard to Los Angeles, deploying the National Guard to Memphis, trying to deploy them to Chicago, trying to deploy them to Portland. Mm-hmm. And I guess from your perspective, what does that look like?
It's distressing and shocking, and it seems like it's a tipping point in America. I mean, we're not following the law anymore. We're not following the Posse Comitatus Act and the Hatch Act, and there's just a complete disregard for Congress. And labeling your political enemies, somehow the enemy within, it's un-American, and hopefully people are going to call him to account for it.
Do you feel like enough people are calling him to account for it?
They aren't. Our congressional delegation has been pretty passive about the whole thing, and they should be speaking up. Dan Sullivan in particular, there's a guy that's a lawyer and a retired military officer. He knows better, but he seems to have just decided to surrender to the power.
Dan Sullivan has said on the record that he supports the deployment of National Guard for law enforcement purposes. That seems like what they're being used for.
They're not. They're landscaping, picking up trash, getting humiliated. They're tanking National Guard recruiting because people don't want to be in the National Guard now because they're seeing what they're doing with the National Guard. People in the National Guard used to take pride in the fact that they were there to help their fellow Americans. And now they're supposed to be hurting them somehow if they're from a political party that disagrees with the president. I don't think that's what our U.S. senators should be promoting. But
one question that's kind of unrelated that hasn't really been in the news that much, but it came up when I was reading things to get ready for this, were concerns about whether constitutional rights of military personnel are adequately protected within the armed forces justice system today. It was a little article that talked about hurried investigations, suppressed evidence, undue command influence, and how investigations were conducted, and the inability for service members to seek redress in civilian courts.
Well, one of the problems that's happening right now is they're trying to get rid of the lawyers in the military. And the lawyers in the military were often the ones that were protecting people from unjust behavior by commanders. I would say, not every JAG lawyer is perfect or anything. I mean, there's the good, the bad, just like in any organization. But a lot of the JAG lawyers took their job seriously, and they thought their job was to provide due process and follow the evidentiary rules and carry out the law and that sort of thing. And they're now trying to get rid of lawyers and get them out of the way. And that's not good for service members' rights. And then Pete Hegseth's speech was also disturbing in that regard because he seemed to be giving a green light to bad behavior. He doesn't want people to be able to have the inspector general look at them. He doesn't want anybody to be investigated for anything. If you bully somebody, he thinks that should be okay.
No anonymous reports.
No anonymous reports, which is bad because you're not going to get reports then. If everything has to be tagged with a name. I did see people in the military who reported stuff that was bad that was happening and put their name on it. They would get retaliated against. You'd see retaliation against people. In fact, at one point in my career, I had not complained about a commander, but somebody else in my unit had complained about the commander. And the commander thought I was the one who had complained and was retaliating against me because she thought I had filed the complaint when I hadn't filed it. It was somebody else. So I saw that kind of stuff going on, but that kind of thing can happen in any organization, but it's particularly bad in the military where, it's life and death stuff for people.
Mm-hmm. Last topic, what's happening off the coast of Venezuela.
Yeah, and other places, right?
Yeah, so this week, Admiral Halsey, who was the U.S. Southern Command, resigned. He was only a year into
Yep.
his assignment, which is unusual. They normally serve for 3 years. Has to do with retirement. Like, he won't be retiring as a 4-star if he doesn't do all 3 years. So there's a lot of people wondering why he's suddenly resigning. But the most common theory is that because he's uncomfortable about the unusual operations of blowing up ships.
Right. So I don't know anything personally about that, but the operations appear to me to be illegal. And I say this from the point of view of somebody who taught national security law, and I brought the book along in case you wanted to look at it. But the president isn't allowed to declare war. That's a congressional writ to declare war, and Congress has never authorized the use of force in this manner. There's a use of force resolution, but it doesn't cover attacking boats on the high seas because they're from Venezuela, even if they are drug traffickers. The logic keeps shifting, and there has been no release of any legal opinion by the administration that supports this. The usual drill, by the way, in the military, which you may know from your service in the Guard, is that before U.S. forces go in to use force, there's supposed to be a legal opinion that's written that justifies the use of force. So some JAG is supposed to sign off on, this operation is authorized under the Constitution or under whatever, the congressional use of force operation. The president's only logic appears to be self-defense. But if self-defense means that you get to kill people who are producing a product that Americans are consuming that you feel is harmful to Americans, that there's kind of a slippery slope there and it never ends. And the problem is we don't know who's making the judgment call. There's no due process. It's total violation of international law. You're just not allowed to do any of this. And they are claiming self-defense, but there's been no showing that there's a particularly imminent risk to any Americans from these boats. I don't know why they can't just capture the boat and try people in court for drug smuggling if they really are drug smugglers.
I've never thought that I would agree with Senator Rand Paul, but I watched his speech to reporters saying that when the Coast Guard stops suspected boats carrying drugs, that 1 out of 4 of them actually don't have drugs on board. And if we've, blown up 6 ships, is like our usual rate of success would show that we've blown up a boat that didn't have drugs on it. Like that's just our success rate, and that we shouldn't be doing this, that there's no way they can guarantee that they've got the right people.
Well, even if they could guarantee they had the right people, you're not supposed to murder people because they are committing a crime. You're supposed to bring them to court and try them for the crime in court, not just summarily execute them.
It seems like this particular issue should be something that the entire legislative branch should be in an uproar about. It doesn't feel like they are.
They should be in uproar because he's stepping on congressional power, but that's been a problem across the board in the government, though. Congress is weak right now, and they don't care that their prerogatives are being trampled on by the executive. They don't seem to care about funding. He's allowed to spend money, even though Congress supposedly has appropriations power. Congress right now is at the weakest point I think it's ever been historically in terms of asserting its power. And that should concern Americans because we're supposed to have checks and balances. And if one of the branches of the government no longer wants to check the executive, the legislative branch no longer wants to check the executive, we're in trouble. We're not going to have a functioning democracy very shortly.
Today, we're recording this interview during the No Kings March. As I told you when we came in, I was like, I'll skip anything to interview Margaret Stock. So I'm thankful to have this interview time with you. That is happening right now.
Right.
For all reports that I've seen on the media, this is potentially the largest protest in U.S. history in terms of the number of participants. I don't want to say that I'm pessimistic, but I'm not sure that's going to change the behavior of our legislature.
I don't know that it'll change their behavior, but maybe it'll mean that next year in the elections that people will no longer be serving anymore who aren't willing to stand up for the prerogatives of the legislature. Maybe enough people will decide we've just had it with Dan Sullivan being a craven coward and we're going to throw him out of office and put somebody in there that's going to stand up to the president. Because it's obvious what's going on. Trump himself was upset about people peacefully demonstrating and calling them anti-American. Nobody's anti-American that's out there protesting. They're pro-American. They're trying to preserve our Constitution and our democracy and our constitutional rights. Seems kind of obvious from the signs. The irony is, this is next year's 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I'd encourage people to go read it. Trump says he's going to be celebrating the Declaration of Independence. I think that's because he hasn't read it. If you go down the litany of the grievances that the colonists had against King George, President Trump seems to be doing a lot of the things that are on the grievance list, including one of my favorites. He's preventing the migration of people to these states and preventing the naturalization of foreigners. And that was one of the grievances that the colonists had against King George when they declared independence. It was actually a grievance that was higher up on the grievance list than the tax grievance. But if you go down the list of all the stuff that, people are upset about him doing, a lot of it is King George stuff. So no kings is appropriate if you read the Declaration.
I'd like to finish by just asking a question about immigration.
Mm-hmm.
I ran into Issa Spachasono.
Right. Issa,
who used to be the director of the Alaska State Refugee Resettlement for Catholic Social Services. And basically what she said is that many people are self-deporting. She said there's just a lot of folks who are so afraid that they are leaving. And she said, we've seen that in the Ukrainian population and other populations, that they're like, no, I can't live with this kind of stress. And I don't know if you have heard the same thing about folks who are leaving the country to escape what we're seeing on TV, of people being accosted in the street, people being taken away with no due process.
Yeah, and I'm not just seeing it with immigrants, I'm seeing it with American citizens. There's been a huge uptick in Americans contacting our office because they want to move to another country. And they're just trying to figure out how to get out of here. And they're U.S. citizens that are just afraid. Maybe they're reading history and they're going, just not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. So I need to get out of here. But the immigrants are definitely doing that. And unfortunately, it's not just undocumented immigrants that are doing it. It's perfectly legal people who are big contributors to our state. And they're just saying, hey, this is not what I bargained for. I thought America was the land of freedom, and now it looks like it's slipping into fascism, and I just don't want to be around here anymore. It's safer to go to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, name your country, Italy, Ireland.
Well, I'm actually in the middle of doing a series on Americans who have left the country and asking them not only about why they decided to leave, but how they did it, because a lot of people have been talking to me about it. And my next door neighbors moved to Portugal, and, I've been having these conversations. I'm not leaving the country. And I think there are some folks who've been almost offended by me doing this series of interviews with folks who've left the country, because I think they kind of feel like that's the coward's way out, to not fight for the country, to just kind of give up and be like, hey, I'm just going to go someplace where we have healthcare and good schools and don't have to worry about all this crap.
I think it's going to depend on the individual and what their issues are. Certainly, it might sound great to stay in the country and fight, but if you don't have health care, how are you going to do that? Or if your kid's not going to be able to go to school, or they're going to get shot up in a school because nobody's willing to enforce the rules to prevent kids from coming to school with guns, or you can think of a whole host of other reasons why people might not want to stick around, and it would be perfectly logical and rational. And we don't know how bad it's going to get is the problem. So the people that are reading history and going, it's going to get really bad, are probably smart to get out faster than the people that are saying stick around and fight. And I can't predict the future either. I don't know if it's going to get better. I mean, I'm heartened by the large size of the protests, but that doesn't mean they're going to win, and we could end up in a situation where they start rounding people up who went and protested. And if that happens, I think you're going to see a big uptick in people thinking it's perfectly rational to get out. But
what advice are you giving to folks when they call and say, hey, I'm American, but I want to leave the country?
It's their decision to make. But a lot of people are just trying to figure out if they can get an exit plan in place. So they're trying to get dual citizenship in another country. That's pretty common. Even people that aren't planning on leaving right away are often inquiring about how to get a passport in another country. And that's pretty rational. I don't see anything particularly bad about trying to pursue a passport in another country if you think that's your exit plan. You're not leaving yet, but if it gets really bad, you're going to have an option to leave.
Where would you go?
If I could go to any country in the world, I'd probably go to Japan just because I like it so much. But I'm not qualified to be a Japanese citizen, so I'd probably have to pick a European country or Canada. The Canadians would take me, interestingly,
Why would they take you?
because I qualify for immigration to Canada.
Why?
Because my education, and I run a small business, which I could operate from Canada. I could employ Canadians. You can do that in a lot of countries that have treaties with the United States. The U.S. has a treaty with Canada that lets small business owners run a business in Canada. But I'm not planning on moving, just to be clear on your podcast. But, it's a global world and people are mobile. And so it's natural that they might think, I don't want to be in that country anymore if they're behaving badly there. And I think, this is part of this whole conversation here. America has been a superpower for more than a century now because people wanted to be here. And we lose our power if people no longer want to be in our country. Our Constitution has been our security blanket. And you probably are too young to remember this picture from the ABA magazine years ago, right after 9/11. They had a picture of a girl sleeping peacefully in her bed on the cover of their magazine. And she had a blanket over her, and the blanket had the U.S. Constitution written on it. And so the gist of the picture was the Constitution as our security blanket. That's been true for more than 100 years, that people are attracted to come here because they liked the fact that we were a nation of law and that the government was going to follow the law, and that if you were corrupt, you were going to get prosecuted, and if you broke the law, you were going to get put in jail. That's been an attractive thing.
And if you're innocent, you wouldn't be locked up.
Right. And if you're innocent, you're not going to get locked up, and the police aren't going to beat you up. And, these things make people want to come to America. And unfortunately, we're now sending a message to the world that maybe you don't want to live in this country, And I'm seeing a lot of that where people are just changing their minds about coming here. On the immigration front, a lot of people are leaving because their relatives can't come to the country. So the new immigration regime is barring a lot of people or deporting a lot of people, and that's causing the American citizens around those people to move to a different country because they want to be with their family. We've had a powerful pull to this country, which is family unity. Our immigration policies were designed to allow families to live together peacefully in America. And now we're seeing their families are getting ripped apart. And so different members of the family now are deciding that they're going to just relocate because they want to be with their loved one who's not allowed to be in the United States for whatever reason. And I'm seeing a lot of that. And that's actually happening a lot with military families now, where I'm seeing that somebody in the family can't live in America, even though they're married to a member of the U.S. military. So the military member is either leaving the service and moving overseas, or they're trying to get stationed overseas because they can live safely in Germany with their family member, but they can't live in the United States safely. And that's been a big change. That was not the case a year ago, that the U.S. government was actively fostering the destruction of military families through the immigration system. And that's true now. I don't know if you've seen all the late news coverage, but they're grabbing military parents and trying to deport them, and military spouses and trying to deport them. And that doesn't help the morale of the U.S. military at all. We're also going to be seeing some recruiting problems. You're interested in the National Guard, but the National Guard has actively been trying to recruit immigrants for the last 10 years because otherwise they have a recruit shortage. And they're going to start seeing that program failing here shortly with the new policies, unfortunately.
Well, last question I ask folks is if they have a book they want to recommend. Do you have a book you want to recommend?
Sure. So the book I would recommend is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar El-Akkad. And he's an interesting character because he wrote a novel, a dystopian novel about the United States falling apart a couple of years ago that seems to be coming true now. And he talks about the impacts of climate change on the country and how it ends up splitting into like red states and blue states. And it mentions Alaska. So I would also read his novel. But that book is more about commenting on the current state of political affairs and how someday we're going to look back on this and go, oh, I wasn't in favor of that. Kind of like the Germans all saying after the World War II, I wasn't a Nazi.
Well, one thing that was kind of fascinating is with the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the crackdown on free speech, Hegseth, I think 300 investigations into folks in the military who may have posted something negative about Charlie Kirk after the assassination.
Yeah, so this is interesting. If you have so many investigations going on in your organization, there's something wrong with the leadership. This is just the political winds changing, and suddenly a different person is, somebody you're not allowed to talk about. And it should be fundamental free speech that, nobody was saying anything threatening. They were just making negative comments about Charlie Kirk, and now you're not allowed to say anything negative about Charlie Kirk, apparently, which is the epitome of violation of the First Amendment.
Well, I think the thing about the First Amendment...
Give me your list of all the people I'm not allowed to talk about anymore.
Exactly. Well, I feel like the First Amendment is to protect speech that you don't like.
It is. That's the point. Yeah. The whole point of it.
Yeah, no one needs protection if you're saying speech that everyone likes all the time.
That's correct. Yeah.
Well, Margaret Stock, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklife.gov or call 907-269-0123.